Good morning, friends. I again welcome you for our next lecture on nature and elements of poetry. William Henry Hudson, in his book An Introduction to the Study of Literature, in chapter number 3, has discussed this particular topic of poetry, and we, as the students of literature, it is mandatory for all of us to study the nature and elements of poetry, because when we were discussing our previous chapters, in one of the chapters we discussed that we, as the students of literature, must know what are the important forms of literature. Friends, the authors whom we are studying, they try to express their ideas, their emotions through different forms of literature. We have various forms of literature like poetry, drama, novel, short story, essay, biographies, autobiographies, travelogues. These are the different forms of literature. Among all these forms of literature, poetry is considered as the most ancient art, because if you examine all the ancient literatures of all cultures of the world, whether it is Greek culture, whether it is Indian culture, whether it is British culture, whether it is Latin or Roman culture, in most of the ancient times, in most of the cultures, the literature which was written in the poetic form. So, we may say that poetry is the most ancient art among all forms of literature. And when we are studying this English literature, we must know what a poetry is, what the definition of poetry is, and what are the important elements or features or characteristics of poetry are. So that is what we want to discuss in this lecture today. 1 minute. So the first thing that comes to the mind before us is the study of the difference between prose and poetry. Because if you want to understand what poetry is, you must first of all understand the difference between prose and poetry. Because all kinds of expressions are done in these two different manners in literature. Either the author writes and expresses his thoughts, his ideas in prose, or he expresses his ideas in poetic form, which is known as poetry. So we have these two important forms of presentation, of expression, prose and poetry. And the difference between this prose and poetry is not so much difficult to understand, because poetry and prose, these are the common forms of literature where prose is written with words, paragraphs, and they do not have any metrical composition, metrical structures. But on the other hand, poetry is a form of literature which is based on particular form, which creates rhyme, which creates rhythm with the help of meter. So the basic difference between prose and poetry is that we have sentences and paragraphs on the one hand in prose, and on the other hand we have some lines, some stanzas which are full of rhythm, which is full of metrical composition, and this is called poetry. So we know even a child understands by just having a look at the paper. The child can decide whether it is prose or poetry. But friends, this is just an external view of prose and poetry, which is not so much important. We must know and understand the poetry from inside. What makes poetry a poetry, or what are the essential elements of poetry that we need to understand first when we are studying poetry? There are different definitions of poetry available to us. This question, what a poetry is, it is easy to understand, but it is difficult to define well. There are different critics available to us in literature who have tried to give various definitions of poetry, and all are suggesting at some of the common things. So if you want to understand the characteristics of poetry, when you examine the definitions of poetry, different definitions of poetry, you can cull out, you can pick some characteristics from these definitions. So first of all, we begin with this definition. On the screen you can see Mill, who is a critic of English literature. He has defined poetry by saying that poetry is the thought and words in which emotion spontaneously embodies itself. I repeat it again. Poetry is the thought and words in which emotion spontaneously embodies itself. So here in this definition, Mill talks about the three terms. Number one, poetry is the thought. Poetry is the thought. And second, he says the words. Poetry is the use of words. Which words? The words which carry some thoughts. And these thoughts, these words which are carrying the thoughts in this, emotions, spontaneous emotions. Spontaneous means all of a sudden, naturally, the natural emotions come out and mix with these thoughts. It is called poetry according to Mill. I repeat it again in my own words. Let me explain this in short again. Mill wants to say that poetry carries two things. What two things? Number one, thoughts, ideas, and number two, natural, spontaneous emotions. And these two are carried by the words, and such words are known as poetry. I hope the definition is clear to you. Let's go to the next definition. Macaulay. Macaulay has defined poetry in a different manner. He says that poetry is an art of employing words. Poetry is an art of using words in such a special manner, in such a manner as to produce an illusion or the imagination. The art of doing by means of words what the painter does by the use of colors. So here, Macaulay has tried to compare two different arts. Art of writing poetry and the art of painting. He says that what a painter does with the help of colors, the same job is done by the poets with the help of words, because words are the tools of the poet as brush and color are the tools of the painter. What does the painter do? The painter produces that imagination which he imagined. He produces that imagination in his picture, which when we see, we also, as the viewers of the picture, we also imagine the same thing. This picture has such quality that we can imagine what the poet imagined. In the same manner, the poet, when writes poetry, he uses words, he employs his words, but he uses the words in such a manner that it creates a kind of illusion on the imagination. Means he creates an imaginative picture before our mental eyes. When we read poetry, we visualize what is written by the poets. We start imagining what the poet imagined when he wrote this poetry. So, in a way, you can say that Macaulay has compared the art of writing poetry with the art of painting. And in short, he wants to say that, it creates the pictures of imagination in the minds of the readers. I remember one popular saying in English literature. It is said that painting is a mute poetry and poetry is a speaking picture. Here also, this painting and poetry are compared. I repeat this again. It is believed by some of the scholars that painting is a mute poetry, and poetry is a speaking picture. Sir Philip Sidney, an important critic of English literature who lived during 16th century in England, when he defines poetry, he also says that poetry is an art of imitation, a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. He says that poetry is an art of imitation. Imitation means copy. He says that the poet imitates this life, this nature, this society, and this imitation must be a speaking picture. I mean, the words must create sounds in poetry. So it is all about the play of words. Writing poetry is all about the play of words. And Macaulay also believes that it is the spatial use of words in such a manner that it has the power to produce the illusion on the imagination. It is the art of using words in such a manner as to give the effect, the same effect what the painter does in his poetry. Let's move on to discuss another definitions of poetry. Carlyle, he also wants to say that poetry is a musical thought. Here Carlyle talks about the two important things. Number one, he says poetry is musical. And number two, this poetry must have one very important thought in it. Poetry, according to Carlyle, is the presentation of thought in the musical manner. So, according to Carlyle, poetry carries music with it. Music means what? Music takes rhyme with it. Music takes rhythm with it. Music takes meter with it. And the poetry, according to him, is the presentation of thought. But this thought must be musical. It's a very small, simple definition of poetry given by Carlyle. Let's take another definition given by P.B. Shelley. His full name is Percy B.C. Shelley. P.B. Shelley is a romantic poet of the period of Romanticism, 1798 to 1830. This small period of 32 years is known as the period of Romantic Revival, age of Romanticism. And in this age, during this age, there were some important poets like P.B. Shelley, William Wordsworth, Astor Coleridge, John Keats. They were writing beautiful poetry. Shelley was also a poet. Shelley, as a poet, has defined poetry by saying that poetry is the expression of imagination. Simple things. According to him, poetry expresses the imagination of the poet. So far, we discussed 3-4 definitions of poetry. From all these definitions of poetry, we can understand that poetry is the spatial use of words. Why spatial use of words? Because poetry is a musical thought. Spatial use of words means poetry takes meter, there is a use of meter, rhyme in these words which makes it musical. Poetry also carries some thoughts, some ideas with it. And poetry must have the capacity to create a kind of illusion, create a kind of picture in the minds of the readers. What picture? The same picture which the poet imagined when he was writing poetry. So, imagination is an important aspect of any poetry. Number one, thought or ideas is again an important aspect of poetry. Number two, and metrical composition, meter, use of meter, rhyme and rhythm is also very important in poetry, which makes it poetry. This is number three. This is what we have understood so far from the definitions that we have discussed. Let's move on to discuss another definition. It's there on the screen. This definition is given by S.T. Coleridge. Again, Coleridge, as I told you, is a romantic poet, lived during the age of Romanticism. S.T. Coleridge says that poetry is the antithesis of science, having for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. Now here, Coleridge compares poetry with science. According to him, the immediate object of science is truth. Object means function, goal, motto. What is the object of science? What is the function of science? The function of science is to tell the truth, is to present the truth as it is. And what is the function of poetry according to Coleridge? Coleridge says that the function of poetry is to give pleasure, not truth. So this is the basic difference between science and poetry according to Coleridge. And that's why Coleridge says that poetry is in the antithesis, is the antithesis of science. It is quite opposite to science. If one is the east, the other is the west. What poetry is, science is not. And what science is, poetry is not, because both have different functions. One aims at achieving truth and the other aims at achieving pleasure or delight. So, Coleridge here wants to say that poetry is an art which is opposed to the works of science. Poetry is an art which is opposed to the works of science, and it must give pleasure to the readers. So here Coleridge mainly talks about the function of poetry. Anyways, let's move on to discuss the next definition given by his contemporary William Wordsworth. Wordsworth, a contemporary of Shelley, Coleridge, he also lived during the same age of Romanticism. According to Wordsworth, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, recollected in tranquility. Poetry, according to him, is an overflow of emotions, feelings. But what kind of emotions? Not common, simple emotions. He talks about the strong emotions, powerful emotions. Poetry is the expression of powerful emotions. And this powerful emotions, it comes out naturally, spontaneously, without any efforts. So poetry, according to Wordsworth, is an art which comes naturally in the poet. But there is a problem. If you take this part of the definition, then there is a problem. Because when there is an overflow of emotions, say for example, I am roaming somewhere on the seashore, and my heart leaps up when I see the beautiful scenario of the beautiful scene of the ocean. Okay, my heart is full of emotions. I become so happy, that there is an overflow of emotions. And when at that time, say for example, I start writing poetry, is it possible? No, it's not possible. Because it might happen that when there is an overflow, when I am standing at the seashore, when there is an overflow of emotions in my heart, I might not have a pen with me, I might not have a paper with me. Or if at all I have a pen and paper with me at that time, when I start writing, because writing is something which is mechanical, when I start writing that, what happens? My overflow stops, because writing comes from here. It's a matter of thinking, it's a matter of intelligence, and emotions come from here. It's a matter of feeling. When this starts working, this stops, so the overflow stops. So one cannot write poetry at that particular time. And that's why William Wordsworth further in his definition says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, fine, but it is recollected in tranquility. At that time the poet does not write poetry, but when the poet goes back home, after visiting that beautiful scene, the seashore, the ocean and all, he becomes so happy. There is an overflow of emotions when he comes back home at night, when he is sitting on his sofa, or when he is lying on his bed, when the atmosphere is tranquil. Mark this word which is on the screen, tranquility. When the atmosphere is tranquil, tranquil means peaceful, peaceful. When there is no disturbance, when there is a peace of mind, you recollect. Recollect means you try to remember that experience. You recollect that experience, and then you start writing your emotions on a piece of paper. That becomes your poetry according to William Wordsworth. Okay, so William Wordsworth mainly talks about the emotions, and these emotions must be natural. It is an overflow of strong, powerful emotions, and this overflow must be natural. It is not by efforts that these emotions come. When there is a natural overflow, spontaneous overflow of emotions, and then after some time, when your mind is cool and calm and peaceful, when there is tranquility, you pen down your emotions on a piece of paper. That becomes poetry according to William Wordsworth. Another definition which is on the screen, you can see, is given by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe has defined poetry and said that poetry is the rhythmic creation of beauty. Now, Edgar Allan Poe has mainly talked about the two important things here. One, poetry is a rhythmic creation. That means he talks about the use of rhyme, the use of meter in poetry. It's a creation, but it's a it's a creation, but it's a rhythmic creation. Rhythmic creation of what? According to him, it's a rhythmic creation of beauty. Poetry, according to Edgar Allan Poe, aims at achieving beauty. So poetry must present beauty in it. So these are the two important things for Edgar Allan Poe: use of rhythmic words and the presentation of something that is beautiful. Okay, let's take another definition by Professor Courthope. This professor says that poetry is the art of producing pleasure by the just expression of imaginative thought in metrical language. Again, the previous definitions which we discussed, this definition also talks about the same elements which we discussed in some other definitions. According to him, poetry is an art. Art of what? It is the art of producing pleasure. So for here, again he talks about the function of poetry, that poetry aims at achieving pleasure. Remember Coleridge, we just now discussed Coleridge. Coleridge says that the immediate object of poetry is pleasure, not truth. Coleridge compared poetry with science and said that the object of poetry is to give pleasure. Here, this professor Courthope also says the same thing, that the poetry is an art of producing pleasure among the readers. How this pleasure is created? The pleasure is created by the just means proper expression of imaginative thought. And this imaginative thought, here he talks about two things: imagination and thought. Some thought must be there in poetry, imagination must be there in the poetry, and this imaginative thought must be expressed in metrical language with the help of meter, rhyme or rhythm or melody. The poet expresses the imaginative thought, and this expression of imaginative thought, according to Professor Courthope, it gives pleasure to the readers. So, we have discussed so far different definitions of poetry, and when we look at all these 7, 8, 9 definitions of poetry, we can come to the conclusion that poetry is an art which carries thoughts, emotions, imagination, and this combination is expressed in such a manner that there is a use of metrical composition, there is the use of rhyme, meter, rhythm, melody, and it is presented in such a manner that it gives pleasure to the reader, it delights the reader. This is the gist of all the definitions that we have discussed so far. Okay, so when you read all these definitions, you come to a conclusion that in fact these things like imagination, emotions, thoughts, meter, rhyme, these are actually the elements of poetry. These are actually the most important characteristics of poetry. These are the things which make poetry a poetry in the real sense of the word. Friends, here we end up for today. The rest part of this discussion, that means in the next lecture we will discuss the elements of poetry. That portion we'll discuss now onwards in the next lecture. So far, I hope the different definitions of poetry are clear to you. So friends, stay home, stay safe. Goodbye. Thank you.